Please hold whilst we connect you to Redacted.
This is Lucy Bishop.
And this is Fraser Greenfield.
This is David Caon, and you're listening to Redacted.
David Caon is the founder and head of Caon Design Office, an industrial design studio based in Sydney, Australia. Hailing from South Australia, David spent nearly a decade in Europe working with George Sowden, Jerszy, Seymour, and perhaps most notably, Marc Newson. Since 2009, Caon's team has been the driving force behind the new wave of aircraft interiors and airport lounges, shaking up the post-pandemic world.
Who is David Caon in 100 words or less?
Well, David Caon is a mid-40-something-year-old industrial designer, currently living and working in Sydney with a passion for a lot of things in the design world, including transportation, as was mentioned before, but also product design, furniture design, branding and visual communications, anything that creatively can lend some weight to companies and brands in the world today.
I'll say it for everyone here, you don't look a day over 36.
Thank you.
And how did you discover the field of industrial design?
I sort of came to it in a bit of a roundabout way. I was always very interested as a child in drawing and art, and I thought that, art was the thing that I was interested in, but I always used to draw mechanical things like cars and planes and mechanisms, robots, that kind of thing. I was never sort of one to draw flowers or landscapes or portraits, even though I had quite a good drawing hand as a youngster, something that sort of has whittled away over the years. But I didn't really know what the output of that might be. So I always thought that as a job, I would be doing something like, I don't know, business or something like that. My father was a restaurateur, and I thought I might end up in that industry. And I didn't really think that industrial design was something that I might do or that could be done or could be studied until I was in university and studying economics and failing quite badly at it, actually. And at that point, I noticed that the industrial design university degree was available and could be transferred into, and that I could potentially go into the field without a portfolio, which I did not have. So that's kind of how I fell into the technical side of the profession, or at least starting my education. But really, I guess the behaviours were always there. So I was always tinkering in the shed with my grandfather, who was an amateur carpenter, building things like skateboard ramps, and I even tried to build a skateboard, which was not very successful. And, fascinated by, my favourite toys were Lego and all of that kind of stuff as a little kid. And as I got older, it became more about sort of expressing myself or making things that I wanted or that I wanted to try and make. And whether there was a bit of electronics in that, or whether there was, really just carpentry or a little bit of metal work or that kind of stuff. So I was always in that area, but I didn't really see the career path to it until eventually, I entered that more formal trajectory through university and then exited that and started my career.
So wait, why did you initially choose to follow the footsteps of Adam Smith?
Adam Smith? Who's Adam Smith?
The world's first economist.
Right. To be honest, there was maybe a little bit of interest there, and I'm probably more interested in business now than I was genuinely back then. But it was the absence of a decision. I made a decision, which is sort of, I think you've always got to be doing something. So I did that, but most of my subjects were sort of things like Japanese language and history and things like that. And then the key economist or the key economic subjects, I didn't have a lot of skill at. I still don't.
What was the culture shock like going from economics into industrial design?
Oh, it was a reverse culture shock. It was kind of like finding the right place to be eventually.
Like finding home?
Yeah, in a way. I didn't like school as a kid, and I didn't like university in that first year very much. And then eventually I found somewhere that I did enjoy going to, and subjects that I did enjoy and was interested in. I mean, there were still things about it that I didn't love, and I thought it was too long, and I still think all those courses are too long.
I'm into that.
For me, it was. I was there for like 6 years.
I don't think you need to be there 4 years. I don't think you need to be there for 2 years, to be honest. I think
Totally.
my experience was, as soon as I finished university, you think you're a fully fledged designer. You actually know nothing about design.
You're basically about to start your apprenticeship, right?
Well, yeah, and I do think that in certain careers, and design is one of them, that apprenticeship is a far more valuable pathway to becoming a professional than the academic side of it. But I'm in a hurry to do everything.
Me too.
Looking back at it, I was just very, very impatient.
I definitely feel like I clawed my way through uni. I'm pretty like neurodiverse, so the traditional like learning environment's quite difficult for me. So I consider myself kind of lucky to have made it out in one piece.
I don't think there needs to be anything traditional about the learning environment in a creative industry. And I think the amount of things that I learned by doing, when I went through university, and it's more than 20 years ago now, when I went through university, that was on the crest of, the rise and rise of 3D CAD modeling software. So in our first year, we actually sat down at drawing boards. In our second year, they presented us with computers, but they didn't really have anyone to teach us how to use them. So we had to be very self-sufficient in learning all that software. And that's something that has just been carried through the rest of my career. And I guess it was always a little bit of a natural approach. I was never patient enough to sit down and learn something, but I was always patient enough to sit down and fail at something, or try and try and try. And in many cases, that took way longer than if I would just sit down and read the instructions. So it's maybe a bit of a glitch, but I guess it's a sort of an ingrained part of my particular process. But yeah, look, if I had my time again, I would have maybe gone and done a year as, learn a few basic things and then try to kick the door of a studio down and get in there and be helpful and useful and learn that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing university does a really good job of showing you is, or at least in my case, it was at RMIT, there's so many different fields that you can move into from industrial design.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, I'm not sure that I personally would have known that all those doors were there unless I had have gone to university. I think I would have ended up down a very different path.
Yeah, industrial design strictly, it's a bit of a Swiss Army knife of a profession.
I think that's a really good description.
Yeah, likewise with, the course itself. But in my case, I think I can't remember how many of us graduated that our year. It was 20 something. And I think I know about 4 or 5 of us that are in the profession itself, and people have gone on to a great many other things. And that was almost from the first year out that people just went in all these different directions. And our studio is the same. We tackle a broad range of projects because in some cases we're the right people to do that particular projects. In other cases we can see how the process transfers and, the skill set can apply and the thinking can apply. But it is not a very defined profession. It's not like being a dentist, where you...
No, or a heart surgeon.
That's right.
So what did you do once you graduated?
When immediately after graduating, I sort of set about trying to find work. I was in Adelaide and I came over to Sydney and interviewed with a number of different places, and all of which weren't really taking graduates. They were all they're happy to interview, but they kind of, they wanted to know what experience I had, and, I didn't have any experience to offer really professionally. I worked at 1 or 2 little places, but not seriously. And I eventually, one of my big passions is transport, and particularly cars. I was always mad about cars. I think like every archetypal industrial designer is on some level. I applied for a master's in car styling in the UK and was accepted and left. I went straight over to Europe in order to start that. I mean, there was a bit of a few months gap, so I found myself in Italy and actually never really looked back. I did make it to Coventry for about 3 weeks, and then I bailed out on that. I didn't like the idea of it in the end when I was there.
Hey everyone, this episode is sponsored by PCBWay, the go-to destination for printed circuit board prototyping, low volume production and PCB assembly. If your team is working on electronics and you're in need of prototype PCBs, I can't recommend PCBWay enough. You can get a quote instantly, even if your circuit board schematics are not finished yet. They can also help you with injection molded, 3D printed, sheet metal or vacuum cast prototypes. PCBWay is the circuit board prototyper of choice for companies like Samsung, Siemens, Honeywell, Tesla and Apple. But you don't have to be a big company to use their services. I've personally used their service to instantly get quotes and have prototype PCBs delivered in a timely manner. On top of all that, PCBWay is so excited to be working with us, they're offering a special discount just for our listeners. When you get a quote from PCBWay, be sure to use our promo code REDACTED for a special discount on us. You can find PCBWay in our episode description or go to pcbway.com. Redacted.
So you said before about how you think university should be like quite a bit shorter and should only be like a year or so, and you could like break out and see what you can do. Does that mean if your studio was in a position to hire, you'd be open to hiring people without a formal education?
I don't know if anybody in my office has got a degree or not.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah.
I've never been asked what my degree was and what my scores were and what my test results. None of that. It's all been done off, in the case of my employment history, it's always been done on the case of a recommendation, an association, networking, that kind of thing, and obviously a portfolio and a set of skills, technical skills that I had that they needed. Whether they got a high distinction or a credit or whether I got any of those scores, that's all kind of irrelevant because, in a work environment, in a couple of weeks, months, whatever, you figure out whether somebody's going to stack up or if they're not. And that's just the cut and thrust of how it works. So, I did put myself under a lot of stress to get good grades, and obviously this is, different people have different opinions, and this is only the way that I view it, but it's the tangible outputs rather than the grades that are important. And that's kind of, when I speak to students, that's what I tell them. Just focus on doing the project and having a clear thought process and being able to talk about that thought process. That's more important than the grade at the end of the day, because in design or in anything creative, those grades can also be somewhat subjective. So, I like to...
I think that's really good advice.
Yeah. A lot of the guys that guys and girls that I have here, it's some of them have approached me directly and been persistent and been enthusiastic and right time, right place, that kind of thing. And I've never been trawling through, the list of the year's graduates and who's got all the high distinctions, and that's who I want. It's not.
Totally. I feel like there's a really big disconnect between getting amazing marks at university and thriving in the professional environment as well.
Yeah, because there's a lot more involved in professional environments. There is an ability to speak to clients and to coexist with co-workers and work within a team and fit. Every studio's got a different culture and a different information flow from the top to the bottom and all of that. And it really is a little bit trial and error, understanding how each studio works and your role within that studio. So I think it's almost impossible for a university to properly prepare a student for a studio. There is that point where you've just got to get in there and swim, which everyone can. It just takes a bit of time and takes a bit of understanding about that. But that's why I'm always sort of careful to state where I think the priorities are for me, for young designers coming into a professional environment.
I absolutely agree with everything you've said.
I can definitely confirm that most of the high performers in my class are no longer in the profession, and some of them aren't even working anymore. You said you started working in Europe after a stint in Milan. How does that work out, and what did you do there?
Oh, I was in Milan for the first few years. So I did start out when I first moved to Europe. My family's of Italian origin, so I have family there. I have European citizenship or Italian citizenship. So I was, I didn't have any pressure, or I had quite a lot of freedom to find my feet, which was handy. I went to live with a cousin of mine who was working in a big publishing company over there, and he put me into a job there. He just didn't want me hanging around and being useless for the couple of months that I had before I was due to start school. And I really enjoyed that. I just enjoyed being in a very different society and a very, culturally very different from Adelaide. And, none of my friends could speak English, and that was great for my Italian and all of that sort of stuff like that. And once I'd made the decision to leave Coventry and go back to Italy, then it was I went back to that job. But after a little while, I decided that, that's not what I wanted to do in life. And I really did want to pursue the design thing and started looking around for a position, and came across the, Studio Sowden, as it was called, or Sowden Design, as it was called at the time, George's office. and interviewed with them and started working there, which was really the beginning of my trajectory and my career. That's sort of, I sort of see that as the beginning.
How did that work out? Did you just ring them out of the yellow pages or something?
Memory's a bit cloudy, but I think that there was a position advertised, and it might have been on Course 77 or something like that, but which was sort of in its infancy back in the day. I obviously had quite an okay portfolio, but it was only my university portfolio. It had really no professional work in it. And yeah, that was that first job that I might have mentioned before, that sort of situation you find yourself in where you realize that, you know, you're coming out of that last year of uni, you think you know everything. And then you go into a job like that with somebody who's been doing it for 40 years, and you realize that you actually don't know anything at all. So it was a steep learning curve in the sense that I had to learn a new software to be useful. And, you know, George set a few little challenges for me, little design challenges for me that were tricky, but also importantly, he was very instrumental in introducing me to the network of people that I knew or came to know in Milan. And it was really important to him that I did that, because he's a very social person. And, you know, I met a lot of really influential designers in his studio, you know, Sotsas, Mendini, all those guys, you know, Ross Lovegrove, everybody came through those doors. And George, you know, every now and then had some parties, and it was amazing who would turn up. And that's really how I got heavily involved in design, not just as my profession, but also my entire life. Everything kind of revolved around it. It was not like a job that I went to 9 to 5. It was just the life I was living. And George is the one that introduced me to YerT-Ze Seymour. He came to me one day and he said, look, you know, you should really associate with or get to know some younger designers and just get in the scene a bit that way. And connected me with YerT-Ze, who incidentally lived really close to where I did. So I ended up, you know, working days with George and then going and spending the evenings in YerT-Ze's office, you know, working on bits and pieces, which was much more of an art-based practice. I mean, it was a design practice, but it was, I guess, much more avant-garde about pushing ideas. And I'd done nothing like that or been exposed to anything like that really in university. And so it was interesting because it was very fun. You know, it was a bit punk rock, and it was, you know, we did some crazy things that weren't functional. They were really just about telling stories or making a statement, and it gave me a really good diverse understanding of the design world. Very playful.
What kind of customers buy those sort of things or commission those sort of projects?
Well, a lot of the stuff that I worked on with YerT-Ze, I didn't really work with him that much on his sort of commercial products. He's done a number of little products for, you know, notably like Magis. I sort of worked with him on the installations and exhibitions that he did, and which is sort of like his main practice now. I still follow his work. So we were doing things like, you know, building houses out of expanding foam, you know, cars out of expanding foam, or stools that were made out of motocross seats for motocross bike seats. I know that the customer of that particular store was Karl Lagerfeld, so it was always connected to a reputable gallery and sold that way on the limited edition kind of circuit, that art design world circuit, and that was not something I'd ever considered, and not something that I do. I don't really work in that way myself, but I was involved in it for a little while, and you know, it just broadened my knowledge as well, but at the same time showed me like how wide the possibilities for design are. I mean, I think you've got so many different types of people and so many different types of trajectories in this field, and it just led me to understand that there's just, you know, there's a lot of different paths that we can all take, and they can all be right.
Absolutely. So from one icon of design being Karl to another one, Marc Newson, who you've also worked with. Can you tell us a bit about that?
He's probably his studio is probably the one I had the longest sort of professional relationship with in terms of being employed by somebody. Again, through that same network in Milan, I met Marc through YerT-Ze. Came snowboarding with us one weekend, and an event, you know, we sort of stayed in touch through a number of different design events, crossing paths, and eventually a lot of my socializing saw my performance at Sowden Design dip significantly. I will say that Milan was a lot of fun and maybe a little bit too fun. And so basically I partied too much and became a bit useless at work.
It sounds like you spent that time very wisely, though.
Look, I spent some of it wisely and I spent some of it really stupidly. But I was young, and I enjoyed myself. But George quite rightly one day gave me a tap on the shoulder and said, "This is not working out. You've got to go." And he was well within his rights. He was absolutely right. It was a bit of a wake up call, which I needed. And after interviewing around a little bit in Milan, I also felt like I felt like I'd run into a wall there a bit as well. I was sort of getting in a bit of a hamster wheel I wasn't really progressing. So I reached out to Marc and asked him whether, there might be an opportunity at his office, which was in Paris at the time. And we had an interview and went ahead from there. But that was, I'd always been a big fan of his work and still am. And no, I honestly think that, he's one of the best designers working and will be for a long time. And whether you like the work today or the work from the 80s or the 90s or, the early 2000s, I kind of like all of it. So it was a little bit of it was a big step up in terms of, I guess, the types of projects that I was working on. I went from working on smaller, products, things like chairs and small objects and all the installations, which were quite sort of loose in what we needed to produce, to something that, the first Qantas things that I started working with under Marc. And so the step in professionality or in terms of like the scope of the projects was significant. And I also felt like quite a big responsibility as well. I was aware of I guess, how important the studio was and how well renowned it was. And I didn't want to be the person that was responsible for an average looking or feeling project to come out of that studio. So I felt a lot of responsibility to lift my game personally to the level of the studio, which was great. I mean, I like pressure a little bit. I think in the absence of pressure, we sort of flounder. Well, I do anyway.
I definitely do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do. They just don't realize it. I mean, it's not a feeling to feel under pressure, but sometimes you maybe sort of focusing on that feeling so much that you are able to sort of let the work happen, or it needs to happen. And so, that was an interesting period, that first initial period, until I, became accustomed to the studio and how it operated. It was good. It was out of the comfort zone in a good way.
What was the biggest thing you had to learn?
There wasn't really, apart from French, which I didn't really have to learn, but I did eventually. In some ways, it was a shift. It was quite a big shift because I was moving cities in order to do this. So, I started work straight away. So, that whole thing of having to find a place to live and learn about the city and find your feet there, as well as, also...
Like a baptism by fire.
Yes, because you're sort of responding to that internal pressure I mentioned before, like trying to lift your game professionally, but then at the same time, you completely out of your comfort zone in terms of accommodation and all that sort of stuff like that. So it was a hot dance for a bit there, but I don't remember there being a big learning that I had to make. It was more
environmental.
Yes, certainly environmental, and more sort of realizing that we weren't playing games anymore, that we were working on some serious projects.
So it sounds like you had a whole bunch of opportunities that really came through networking.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's something that's almost missing in the Australian design culture? These kind of studio parties and gatherings where people would get introduced to each other?
It is maybe missing a little bit, and it's something that Henry and I have talked, about doing a little bit of. It is and it isn't, because yes, there was the odd party, but I know a lot of my contemporaries and I'm friendly with lots of my contemporaries. So there are plenty of events that we could go to and associate with and do things like that. There's maybe not enough of like just the designers doing it for themselves. It's maybe a little bit too often attached to an institution or a brand or a showroom or something like that. And so that's probably where we could turn things around and improve. I think anything that's built as a networking function don't go. Like it's a nightmare.
It's a room full of car salesmen.
Yeah, I think the important thing was that it was organic and it allows. It's a good way for, I think, people to meet, because it allows you to understand who the person is, and that's one of the most important things about working with people. It's, skills are one thing, but
Almost like compatibility, right? Like
yeah.
if you're compatible, the rest will come.
Yeah, but and even but that can even just be a vouch.
Mm.
For example, I might reach out to Adam Goodrum and say, hey, look, do you know anyone good at the moment? I need an extra person. Is there anybody that you can suggest, either somebody that's gone through, I know that he does a bit with the university, or, is there somebody around? If somebody vouches, that's kind of often a good first step.
Totally. I just kind of wish there was a little bit more community in the Australian design scene, particularly the Melbourne scene, where we are. I'm not really sure how that kind of comes about, because I think you're right that the idea of like these networking events aren't ever the best, but I'm not quite sure what event sort of takes that place to create that in-person community.
Well, I think...
Or maybe it's happening and I'm not being invited.
Look, I've come down to Melbourne a couple of times. We have a little bit to do with the Oigle Projects Gallery down there and those guys. And so from that perspective, I think that there is a lot of different little communities, maybe not one big community. I think from my, I guess, very cursory read of it, there's probably more in the industrial design thing in Sydney. But again, it's such a broad profession that there are guys, designing things for like big brands that you might sort of see in stores, and then there are guys designing things for galleries, and they're all industrial designers. But those two sets of groups actually cross over very little, apart from potentially, like key parts of the process. So it's a very tough one because the métier is so broad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you notice a contrast in culture when you came back to Australia?
Yes, I did. It's been a long journey to sort of almost get back to where I felt like I was in Paris, in terms of like the kind of projects that we're talking about and the kind of projects that we're looking at. And I don't know whether it's because, the way that this studio operates, it's more of a European model style studio where it's, a little bit based around a principal designer, even though, I'm not trying to sound like I'm doing everything here. It's definitely a team.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that's the difference or why it's been tricky like that. But I find that there's probably a better understanding of the need for quality design in Europe than there is here. And I think I sort of, just after thinking about it for so long, I find that it's potentially it's probably a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
Something that if you look at the typical Parisian apartment versus the typical Sydney apartment, you can sort of see the difference in where people's, I guess, visual appreciation is. And that boils down to what we do. So I do think that design is in many ways undervalued here.
Mm-hmm.
And, can I get it cheaper or can I get it quicker, or, it's not that important. And then, maybe the same potential client doesn't realize why they're buying Mac. It's kind of... It's
everyone wants good design, but they don't want to pay for it here, and there's a bit of a race to the bottom culture.
Yeah, that can be true for sure, and it sort of makes it hard for smaller studios. There's, we don't do a lot of the sort of startup thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
We don't get approached to do that stuff, and that's a very challenging field to work in as well. And there isn't the volume of brands and manufacturing in this country that there once was, where there is, Europe's so much bigger, and there is a very big heritage of production and manufacture that's still happening there, which we lack a little bit here. And I think manufacturing here is a little bit limited in terms of what's achievable. And so it's a little bit of a vicious circle.
I would probably have to disagree on the basis that manufacturing can be done anywhere. It's more businesses here see design as either an extension of engineering or something that is nice to have and not required, which is not untrue. But they don't understand the monetary value of good design. And in fairness, designers in Australia that I've encountered are exceptionally poor at translating what we do into a dollar figure.
Yeah, it seems a little bit crass to quote monetary outcomes of the design, but it's probably a necessary evil in a way. There's very few other areas where products can compete, and I think you've got little to work on other than some anecdotal evidence as well. So I think it's possibly a bit of a sophistication issue. And potentially some of those brands don't necessarily need to compete as much as they do in other markets, which, means that they're not necessarily looking as hard for the angle.
They can get away with being mediocre.
Yes, possibly. Again, the primary issue, I think, is the volume, is that we're not doing as much, and there's not such a big pool of clients here, which therefore makes being a designer more difficult here than elsewhere.
I mean, that's the problem with manufacturing here as well, right? You don't have anyone to help with like the small batch production, but then if you're actually doing proper mass production, there's not many places that can help you with that either.
No, I think anything that
Like there's a real sweet spot in Australia, and if you kind of are on either side of that, there's not much to work with.
No, that's right. And look, I'm manufacturing small batch for myself and my little projects and objects that we make under our Laker brand and whatever, more now than I ever have, with most of it being in Australia, but it's taken a long time to piece together those guys that I can work with to do that. I think, if you're in your first year, it's very, very tricky. It's tricky now, and we've been doing it for a long time. Anything that's bigger than that tends to go offshore for manufacture. And I understand it as well. Typically, those products are competing with products that are manufactured somewhere that has much lower manufacturing costs, and that comes down to labour costs as well as material costs and all of that stuff. Australia, unfortunately, is actually quite an expensive place to live and to work comparatively. It's a wonderful place to live. This is where I want to be now. I don't necessarily want to move again overseas, but it's expensive. So it makes those things really, really challenging. So if you want to do something at scale and you want to get your unit cost to where it needs to be to compete, then unfortunately you've got to look elsewhere at the moment until I think maybe technology can come in a little bit harder and assist more with getting the costs of manufacture down here. And, that's rapid manufacturing technologies and things like that might be able to help with that in the future.
This is probably going to date the podcast by me saying this, but I was actually watching the video that came out about the new Tesla bots doing the sorting of like the Duplo blocks. And that was really quite incredible because it really looks like it would be able to handle quite a few things on an assembly line, which like in turn could end up lowering costs of labor prices for manufacturing locally as well. I feel like that's a fair way off, but I think that could be a like really interesting avenue where we're not exploiting workers and we're able to kind of get back some of that sovereignty of making our own products home.
Yeah, possibly. It's a bit of a scary thought though as well.
It is. I think it's a scary thought on both sides, because if we are looking at trying to bring that manufacturing home, like I definitely wouldn't want to be like exploiting any sort of like workers as well.
No, and that's obviously a very important point in modern manufacturing, is understanding your supply chain and the nature of your supply chain. And I suppose it's, I guess, a careful dance that any brand needs to undertake, making sure that they're making their products as efficiently as possible, that they're not exploiting any particular group of people, any workforce anywhere in the world, but they're also not maybe responsible for giving up jobs that people locally might want. It's becoming a very, very, very complex issue, certainly more complex than it maybe was 50 years ago. I'm a very big fan. I'm very passionate about sort of mid-century Italian design. And I just love the stories that, this was a country was coming out of war. There was a lot of factories that were trying to, survive and find their feet. And they partnered with designers and, started creating homewares and furniture and products and basically revolutionized, the design that I love. And it was all made, there. And I think that's like a little beautiful moment in time that is gone from us now, unfortunately, where, even the Italian brands are manufacturing outside of Italy for sure. So, I know that we can't go back to that, but, that for me was pretty much the heyday of design and manufacturing, when they were really experimenting and basically figuring out how that industrial designer and brand and factory relationship worked.
Shifting ahead a bit, how did you decide that you wanted to start your own studio, and what did that process look like?
I think it was always in the back of my head to have my own practice. I think for a lot of designers, it's a goal. And I came back to Australia. I was doing some work with Marc from here. I also worked with a big architectural company, Woods Bagot, for a couple of years in their interior design department. That wasn't a great fit for me because it's a very big business, it's a very successful business, but it just didn't suit me very well. And I remember I took a little bit of time off just to work on some stuff just on my own, and I understood that this is really what I want to be doing. And I didn't try to do the thing. I mean, a lot of people try to sort of do the side hustle thing and keep one thing going while they're trying to build another thing up. And I knew it wasn't going to work that way. So I just closed one door and I just thanked the guys at Woods Bagot for the learnings and just started my own practice one day. And, that first year was, luckily I had cheap rent. It was a very lean year, but it was invigorating, and I could see that it was working. And it took a while before I was more than just one man band, but it was a not a brutal process, but it was pretty, rudimentary. I stopped working at one place. I did maybe 1 week of work from home, and then pretty quickly realized I can't do that either. I need to find somewhere that I can go to every day, that be my work. I can walk away from that and at the end of the day, and then go back there every day. So I, as much as possible, I tried to pretty quickly create a place to be, but that was it. It was very simple.
You're listening to Redacted. To stay up to date with the show and see what else we've got going on, be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at redacted_design_pod. Subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends. Cheers.
So what was your strategy in the early days for finding clients and projects to work on?
Strategy's never been my strong suit. I was very lucky in the early days that I, that again, it came down to sort of relationships and networking, that people that I knew and people that I had worked with were recommending me for, small little projects here and there, some of them being interior design and some of them being furniture design. So I was able to start the business with, I think, 2 projects running, basically, which was good. I didn't just sort of put up the shingle and have nothing to do. I had something to do immediately.
Do you remember what they were?
Yeah, there was an interior for a furniture showroom that doesn't exist anymore, and there was a range of furniture that Qantas wanted, and so they had actually, of all people, approached Woods Bagot, and Woods Bagot sent them to me, and they said, well, of course we know him. We've been working with him for the last 5 years under Marc Newson. So it was, in a way, it was quite lucky that I was able to quickly reestablish the relationship with Qantas. And so in some ways they were almost my first client of my practice when I started it in 2009.
That's a pretty good client to start with.
Sorry, David, this might feel redundant. Could you just explain Qantas to people who don't know what Qantas is?
Yeah, Qantas is the, referred to as the Australian national carrier, the airline in Australia. It's a very important brand in Australia, if not one of the most recognisable brands in this country. As a client, when I was working at Marc Newson's office, he was the creative director of the airline, and we were undertaking a number of projects for them. So I've worked with them in one way or another since 2003. But effectively, they're, I think, the second oldest airline in the world.
I didn't realise that. Wow.
103 years old. Yeah, they're 102 or 103 years old.
So you obviously had Qantas as a big early client.
Yes.
How did you strengthen that relationship from one project to multiple?
Well, yeah, they were an early client, and as a client, they were big, but the project was little. And that's kind of was the evolution. We started with small things. So it was a couple of pieces of furniture that we were making. Not, I wasn't making it, but I was designing and developing the furniture for them, for their lounges. We were frequently in touch, and they would come to me for smaller things. Marc Newson Limited was still at the time, the sort of go-to studio for Qantas. And I was also involved in some of those little projects as well, as the Marc Newson representative in Australia while I was starting my studio. So it was kind of, I was in and around a number of the different projects that were going on. And things started to get a little bit more serious, maybe around 2014, 2015, when they started coming to me with slightly bigger projects. And I think with any kind of long-term relationship with a client like that, and I'm lucky to have such a long-term relationship with Qantas, but it's really about building trust and also building understanding and being part of that journey. So, you know, I've been working with them now in one way or another, as I mentioned, for, you know, nearly 20 years or 20 years, really. And there's a lot of people within that business that I've worked with for almost all of that time. So a lot of trust has been built up over those years, but also I've been part of and understand the evolution of the brand and what they're going through and what they're doing at different points in their trajectory. So not really a strategy per se. It's more, I guess, an approach.
Can you tell us a bit more about the Caon design process and why it is the way it is?
I'm not sure that my process is wildly different to most other designers, but we do work across a lot of different projects. So, you know, we're doing at the moment, we're doing some interiors. We are manufacturing furniture under our Laker brand with Henry Wilson. We're doing more sort of consumer good product projects, but it often starts with a sort of research and discovery phase where we make sure that we understand what we're getting into, so that we're not proposing things that are mindless to, you know, our clients. So we try to learn about, really, I like to learn about them as people. Last week I was in Western Australia with Paulina. I have, you know, recently started a separate studio called Actuel, which is a visual communication, graphic design, branding studio. And we went out there just to meet some new clients and learn about them and understand what we were doing over there. And that's a really important first step. And I actually like to build that into a bit of a phase of the project where I will come back to them and say, look, this is who we think you are, and this is what we think that you're trying to do. And these are some initial thoughts about what we're going to do next. Do we all agree that we're heading down the right pathway here? You know, I want to make sure that the next step is a logical next step. However creative and wild the ideas might be, that they're heading in the right direction. And so that's actually a key part of the process for us in terms of creativity. The next step is obviously to create the concepts, and how we present that will vary pretty wildly between different projects, you know, AR, VR, mock-ups, models. You know, we love doing lots of different 3D prints and little cardboard things and that kind of stuff. In fact, I do more of that now than I ever did, because I think I value renderings a lot less now than I used to.
Is there a reason for that?
Well, firstly, because I've had some major stuff-ups by, you know, everybody loving a rendering, and then you actually make a prototype of it and it's completely wrong in terms of scale and proportion. And I think that was probably and not recently though, but it was probably an outcome or a side effect of, you know, that wave of CAD, of the CAD world hitting the design world, and the process changing so wildly, and people just being impatient and also being, I guess, wowed by the
Spectacle.
Yeah, by the visual spectacle of a rendering and how real it could look and all that sort of stuff like that, and then actually starting to rely a bit too much on that. I remember anecdotally, sorry to divert a little bit, but I do remember that, you know, George Sowden warning me in those early days that, you know, it's a problem if you're limiting your design or if you're letting the capabilities of the software dictate the design. And I don't think I really comprehended what he was trying to tell me at that point, but I get it now. And in many ways, you know, I've learned how to do less, and how often doing less can be more meaningful in a final product. But, you know, like I said, I get more excited now about a nice bit of cardboard or even a really early stage 3D print that has no detail and no resolution and nothing to it than I do about a render. But I know that the client needs to see renders, so that's stage number 3. And then when everybody's happy, then we get into the long stage, which is the development and manufacturing stage, which is I like it in industrial design. I don't like it so much in interior design. It's very stressful in interior design.
Gosh.
Yeah.
I feel like something people don't talk a lot about with renders is I feel like it's such a key part of the design process, or like for me at least. Like, it's incredible to kind of check your CAD form in a render environment because you get a little bit more of like accurate perspective, and then even bring the modeling back to make changes before you get to that 3D prototyping phase. And I know for me, like, I do a lot of design work in terms of like color, material, and finishes in the render.
Yep.
Which is not necessarily about the end render, but
Yeah.
visualizing it in my head and going through those options as well.
I think the CMF stuff in a render is good, but I'm wary of it because it can be misleading, and you can make it look the way you want it to look, but it might not be that in real life. And that's
of course. Yeah.
probably an area where I think the aviation work and the interior design work has been valuable to the process, because in those two fields you are pulling samples of materials almost from day one, and this whole room is samples and samples and samples and samples of different fabrics, leathers, plastics, steels, timbers, whatever that we've got. And so I kind of don't trust the render for how something will look. I'm very reliant now on the samples. And the samples are great as well because the texture, they convey the texture, and I actually find texture sort of a little bit more important. A lot of the sort of current work that we're doing, I'm almost trying to keep things monotone and play with the texture between the different elements. I find that really interesting, rather than have wild shifts in color between things.
It's really interesting because it's almost like a principle of graphic design, right? Where you're using all the same fonts, but you're using different weights with emphasis on different areas.
Yeah, it's a bit like that, and I think also, over the years, I have, in some cases, worked very hard and pushed very hard to customize colors and customize finishes outside of catalogs and things like that, and it hasn't brought me the right result that I really thought that it would. And that time might have been a little bit better spent, like searching for something that was potentially already there that, could bring me closer to the result that I wanted. So I think design and actually making things, it's a bit of a voyage of understanding how to go about it and how to get the best result depending on the circumstances that you're in, the materials that you're using, the methods that you're using, the time constraints. People never talk about time. Time is probably the biggest element in design. It's the amount of projects that are dictated, and I'm sure a lot of designers out there will be hearing what I'm saying, but the amount of projects that are driven by time factors or decisions that are driven by time factors, no one talks about that because it's a reality of the projects that we are involved in. But there's a number of things that I would have done differently had I had more time. But I don't mind having not enough time. It kind of is what it is. And in some ways, if you're forced to make a decision, just focus on making the best decision within all of those constraints that you possibly can, rather than arguing about if we had more time or lamenting this or that or the other. It's kind of pointless. But it is one of those things that I like to think about and go, well, such an important component to a project and the outcome of a project, and something that's never really actually brought up.
What do you think is the biggest time sink that could be done away with?
Done away with is a tough...
Or at least made more efficient.
Well, client reviews could be made a bit more...
Just get rid of them altogether.
Yeah. I mean, in some cases, I'm like, well, why are you hiring me if you're going to tell me how it should look? But I don't know what could be done away with, to be perfectly honest. I think people, especially people that are new in product development or or manufacturing, don't realize how long it takes.
That's
we do
literally
have
what I was about to say before. Like, people don't realize how long it takes to get something from like that CAD model render, that prototype, to actually landing.
Yeah, you always feel responsible as the designer because that they come to you first and they say, look, we want to do this and that and the other, and we think we'll have it out there in 6 months. And I don't like to be a naysayer or anything like that, but that's kind of impossible no matter what you're doing. I mean, I'm sure there's some things that can be done in 6 months. Certainly, printed things can be, but you still feel responsible. I feel a responsibility to sort of just gently tell people that it does take a huge amount of time. You're never going to get it right in the first go, ever. And, you have to be prepared for all of that as well. For us, and this is more sort of the aviation stuff thing, like those projects are very, very controlled by time. And it's a real structure that we have to operate within. But that's okay. We know where our decision points are. We know where our limitations are, and we operate, as much as we can within those, while kicking and screaming and pushing boundaries as much as we can. That's a particular field of operation, because you're not holding up that production line, and if you are, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like sometimes it can be good having those like really hard deadlines as well, though, because then everyone always knows where you stand.
I'd rather have a
I feel like it's so much worse when someone has a deadline that sometimes moves and sometimes doesn't.
I don't mind a deadline moving, but I'd rather have a deadline than not. And the reason for that is that it drives decisions across the board. It drives action. And we have a couple of projects here that are quite open. We will actively put deadlines on it. If the client won't, we'll do it, because otherwise we won't actually do anything.
Totally. Yeah.
That project will never have priority. So deadlines are kind of critical, I think, to the human psyche in a way, when you're doing something like this, when you're trying to get something done and trying to get something out there. If you don't put some points in there that you have to hit, there'll always be something that steps up to take its place.
I did hear once that, I can't remember who said it, but they said that they think deadlines should be changed to finish lines. It's got a bit of a more positive excitement about it, and I think I kind of agree.
I don't know if it'd make too much difference for me. I'd still, in the back of my head, it'd still be a deadline.
Kind of feels like there's a celebration at the end, though.
I'm sure we can indoctrinate you into finish lines. Checkered flags. I mean, there is that old idiom of, what is it? The scope of work will expand to fill the time allotted for it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's another thing that's actually interesting about a lot of our projects, is that, they often, the scope often increases and the deadline sort of stays in the same spot. So that's an interesting challenge. But I've always, I don't know, I guess I've always been okay with that in a way. And if we really can't do it, then we can't do it. So it's maybe when earlier in my career I would say everything was okay and try to make everything work. And we just don't do that anymore, because I found particularly that the quality of work was really slipping. If we were, burning too much midnight oil.
Yeah, like it can be a disservice to the product.
Yes. And something that I have at different stages of the evolution of the studio and my practice, I have thought a lot about my process and what I want to change about that process. And a lot of those things were around rendering and around all of that sort of stuff like that. Making sure that the focus of the studio was what the client was coming to us to do, which was to create an object, a form, a product, and making sure that the emphasis and the time was put on that, rather than on some big render presentation. If you're spending a day on design and 10 days on renders, then there's an issue there. And obviously in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, that's become, the ability, the capability of those programs it's become easy. It used to be like really, really difficult to do nice imagery. You almost had to have a dedicated person in the studio doing that, which was pretty awful for them as well. And now it's become a lot easier, and I think that's great, because it means that we can put more of our time, focus more on actually the ideas at the beginning, where we really have to be putting, effort, even if we're going to scrap a few of those ideas, even if, we're bringing 3 concepts to a one concept project. Those, I find, doing even those multiple concepts slowly opens up more and more ideas that, you may not have had in the beginning. But that's a whole another conversation. That's where I go down the rabbit hole of, is your first idea the best idea, or do you beat your head against the wall for a couple of weeks? Both of those can be true.
Totally. I feel like sometimes the ideas that you do still sink some effort into are almost as important as the final outcome, because you become more convinced that was the correct path to take.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you just have to let those ideas out to know that they're not the correct ones.
Yeah, sometimes I it depending, project by project, sometimes I will sit there and if I've drawn the same thing 4 or 5 times, then we have to take it to the next step and just see what happens there and whether in the details and whether in the other elements of that, then more will be built around that idea. And that's a trap, not a trap, but it's often the case that I'll sit there and it'll be the same form or the same approach to solving the problem that will come over and over and over again. In the case of like a more simple product, I might sit down with one of my team and, we'll outline 3 ideas. They'll go off and sort of start fleshing them out a little bit. And then sort of I come back into it a little bit. And some of them that I thought were really strong at the beginning might start to take second place a little bit like that. But I don't like to put huge, long periods of time in the concept phase, because I think you can sit on something for too long. I've actually learnt that a lot from Henry, actually. He's way better than me at sort of going, that's enough, it's done. And even if it, and Henry's work is more sculptural, and it's more sort of similar to not an art practice, but he manufactures things like lamps and things out of stone, and where, an interrupted process can sometimes yield a really wonderful and unexpected aesthetic that you didn't think you had. And I've sort of observed that a little bit, and I've just, I've started to, I guess, in my own work, thinking about that, not try to round every corner, polish every angle, like leave things a little bit sort of a bit more, not to say angular, but feeling a little bit like they've sort of just stopped.
All good art is abandoned, never finished.
Exactly. Probably because of the way that I came through my career, there was like more of an obsession to detail, which materials like injection molded plastics and CNC aluminium and those kind of materials, they allow you to do that. And the software will allow you to do that. So then sometimes you do that. Henry has come through his practice casting things out of bronze and aluminium, where because of draft angles and sand casting process, you can't do that necessarily. And so therefore you shut things off in a different way. And then another process, like a rumbling process, will come in and soften off the corners. You have no control over how that looks. And that's the part that I never had in my process, that no control bit, that sort of wonderful accident that I really appreciate. And he knows when that's coming. And he knows that that's part of the makeup of some of these products that he's doing and we do together for Leica. And it's, for me, I was always, well, no, we've got to think about that radius, or this radius is like, don't worry about the radius. The radius is going to come from a bunch of rocks in a tub.
Tumbler, yeah.
And you have no control over it. And I didn't realize how interesting that was until I started, doing it a little bit. And so I'm trying to take a little bit of that to my own initial concepting process of like, why are we trying to control so much? And letting things sort of happen a little bit more fluidly.
You were somewhat known for your historical association with Marc Newson and George Sowden. How have you managed to find your own voice in your work and communicate the value of Caon's design team on its own merits?
Yes, this is true. I'm always asked about the early part of my career. To me, it doesn't affect me very much anymore. It never did, really. I'm a big fan of those 2 guys. I enjoyed working with them. I love working with them. I am always asked about what it was like. But in the case of Marc Newson Limited, I left his studio in 2006. So that's, a very, very long time ago. And George even earlier. I think I don't so much talk about it anymore, but I'm always happy to talk to people about it if they're interested with it. But personally, when I come to talking about my work, I focus on that. And so I focus on our process. I focus on the projects that we're doing in the day. And I just try to share as much as I can and have that be interesting, because I think it's interesting, and hopefully other people think it's interesting as well. But I think I'm quite different to those guys, although I am, obviously influenced by both of those studios. A lot of the aspects of how I run my office has come from those offices, because that's how I learned. I'm not minimizing the influence that they've had on me. It's been fundamental in some ways. But the studio's now been going for 13 or 14 years. It is developing a life of its own slowly. And I guess fundamentally, we haven't really necessarily had a strategy about finding our own voice or talking, but and we're not trying to minimize, I suppose, the association with those guys, other than to say that it's probably was a long time ago.
Like sometimes as a business, you're obligated to do what we call chaff work.
Chaff work.
Yeah, stuff that pays the bills. It might not be high
Yes.
value, but it often leads to more of the same. So, for example, there's plenty of consultancies that they take on one job of point of sale work, and then 3 years later, they're only doing point of sale work. How do you guys navigate this?
I probably had a little bit too much chaff work in my early days. And I mentioned before just taking some time to sit down and interrogate my own process and strategy. Again, I don't really like to say strategy because I don't think it's true that I have a strategy, but I think maybe it's more rules a little bit. In the early days, I was starting a business. I think anybody who's in that right now, it was impressed upon me, cash flow is very important. You've got to get the work in, you've got to do the work. That translated to me probably doing some projects in the early days that I should have done. Not because they were bad people or, unethical or anything like that. It was more a case of it was a project that probably didn't have enough budget. It wasn't going to build up the profile of my studio, and it wasn't going to result in a good project either. So in the end, yes, we made some design fees from it, but that time would probably have been better spent in working on something for some kind of piece that would showcase the work that we could do. And that's, I think, how we look at it now. We do assess projects that come in, and if they are interesting and if we think they can be executed. And, these were things that I didn't interrogate in the early days as much as I do now. I just wanted to do work, and I wanted to get projects in and grow the studio. Whereas now, the studio has got a body of work behind it, and we want to make sure that the work that we do has the best chance of being realized properly, and, can add to the work that we have that sits well. So it's a little bit of that sort of interrogation that you have to sort of objectively do on a project by project basis.
Qantas has been facing some stiff competition on the design front from Air France, Cathay, Singapore Airlines, Etihad, and of course Emirates. What are you guys trying to do to get Qantas back in the top 10 airlines in the world?
Our work with Qantas is, from a design perspective, is we're trying to, and I think we're on, we are working towards, creating a really beautiful and contemporary aircraft cabin interior. We are taking it in a bit of a different direction with these new projects that are coming out, which, some of the imagery's out there. The plane is, probably still another year away or so. And all of those airlines that you mentioned, they have different approaches to that visual aesthetic. But in terms of the work that we're doing, there's a very big focus on, I guess, the emotive angle or the emotive aspect of flying. I think that flying can be quite an emotional experience. Firstly, you're either excited to be going somewhere, or you're a little bit apprehensive about being in an aircraft. And so it's quite, feelings can be a bit raw. But also my job, I think, as the designer, is to make that environment as comfortable, relaxing, but also beautiful as we can, which is challenging in the confines of modern aerospace and manufacture. From an airline perspective, and we're involved in this as well, Qantas will be doing flights that are longer than anyone else. So this next aircraft will be the longest range aircraft in the world. They'll be the longest flights that anyone has ever done. And so from our perspective, the passengers' wellness, physical wellness, and their ability to recover from the flight at the other end of it is critically important as well. So there's been a tremendous amount of research that we've been involved with the airline in terms of what we can do to benefit passengers. And the other airlines aren't doing this. Well, not to the extent that Qantas is. And, that comes down to interrogating what we can do with the lighting in the cabin, to help passengers, phase shift their bodies from one time zone to another one. From a design angle, at the same time, we're trying to make that cabin, as serene as possible. So we're sort of making everything feel a bit more calm, but also, for us visually, that lends into the aesthetic that we've been slowly evolving for the airline over a number of years of this sort of contemporary, but yet somewhat Australian luxury. Luxury's, we all know that that's a word that is sort of used for everything now. And so use that with a grain of salt. But I suppose, say, a Qantas interior versus an Emirates interior, there's two very approaches to the same kind of thing. You're in a first class seat on both. One will have, in the case of Emirates, is very lavish use of, golds and burnished walnuts and cream leathers materials. And what we do is we feel more representative to the Australian sensitivities. We have much more of a sort of minimal, refined type aesthetic, where we focus a little bit more on the details and the junctions rather than, making things glitzy. So I guess it's a multi sort of faceted approach to, creating a unique offering in the sky. And we're involved in the design of everything from the cutlery, crockery, bedding, even some of the stuff you might see on the IFE. So it's a wonderful field to work in, and it's a wonderful client to work for because of the trust that I mentioned before. But also, you take on a project like the cabin of an A350, and you actually end up with about 20 projects rolled into one, all with different elements to them, and you almost have to treat them as individual parts of a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine how that would be really complex as well, because one almost informs the next.
We sort of try to create this overall vision and make sure that everything sort of lives within that vision and is sort of sympathetic to each other. We want the whole process from beginning to end to be not seamless. It's never going to be perfectly seamless because, anyone who's ever taken a flight knows that, things sort of can upset you here and there, but we want it all to be very cohesive and most importantly, everything's very considered. So we are trying to think of everything and things are always coming up as being new factors that have to be considered because the conversation, the dialogue, behind the scenes is constantly evolving.
I have to admit, so before I studied design and when I was kind of just starting to get into it at high school, one of the first objects that really kind of was explained to me by my aunt, who has a really deep appreciation for design, was the Marc Newson water glass from the Qantas planes that have that really thick base, and her explaining to me how the form and the geometry affected its usability in the plane was something that was just sort of like a light bulb moment for me. It was one of those really early design objects for me that sparked a real interest.
Yeah, well, I was part of that project, so don't say it was that early.
Well, my aunt has a little stash of them that she maybe permanently borrows when she's on a Qantas plane.
I believe they were made by Itala in Finland, I think.
They're really beautiful. They're such special cups. And it's such
beautiful.
An interesting layer to add to try to deal with all the gravitational forces in the plane. And
yeah,
you're not only designing beautiful objects, but you're trying to design beautiful objects that don't fall over.
Yes, the stability, those are the couple of the big tenets of aerospace design is stability but most importantly, weight. So that's an obsession that, it keeps coming into our work outside of aerospace because the whole team here works on the Qantas project. That's been something that we've been working on since 2018, that particular project. But, now we find ourselves talking about something completely unrelated for another client, and we're all talking about weight. We don't need to be, but it's kind of
it's the key problem.
But it's
embedded.
It's not bad to make stuff lighter. So I don't think.
I feel often it's a good thing, especially in the age of sustainability. You're probably using less materials with that.
Material isn't free.
Yeah, that's right. One of our products, which is a furniture system that we've been doing over the years, we're working on a new version of that, and a big part of that is to take a tremendous amount of weight out of it purely because of the transportation, assembly, and making it a lot more efficient. So I guess it just sort of lends to the conversation of how different projects inform other ones and how some of those interests can diverge across, I guess, the scope of the projects in the studio.
Absolutely. I'm always so interested in how past projects inform future projects as well, especially when they're unconnected. Feels like these little serendipitous strings.
Yeah, it's often hard to pinpoint as well. Yeah.
Given your studio's portfolio, how do you deal with managing client expectations?
I guess we work pretty hard here. So we have fun, but we work hard. I guess we try to address any expectations very early in terms of what they see coming out of a project or a process. Obviously, it depends on what kind of process, but even if we've got a tremendous amount of experience in something like the aviation stuff, we can quite easily sort of predict that something is going to go a certain way or not. If sometimes we might have less experience, we might be designing something that we've not designed before. Obviously, a lot of similar principles apply, so that's not uncommon. But I think one of the things that I've always strived to do is to be very close to my clients and work very closely with them, and have like an open dialogue. So rather, I'm not really wanting to turn up and just here it is and good luck with it and see you later. Sort of, we, as much as possible, we like to see our projects through all the way. So
I feel like that makes a lot of sense though, right? Like it's almost like the IKEA mentality that people are more connected to their objects when they've like built them themselves by taking the client on a journey with you so that they feel involved. You're more likely to get a product that they absolutely love rather than being completely disconnected until delivery day.
yeah, I like to do that. I like to bring them on the journey. I like to keep them close.
Like I'm not saying invite them into the studio every day, just that like some shared ownership
No, but
is like often good.
well, it's their project. They're the ones that have employed us. They're paying us to do the project. So I can't have complete ownership of the project. It's not mine. It's my client's project, and I fundamentally believe that. So that's why I bring them in as much as can be done. But that said, if I'm looking at a particular problem or a situation, or even and we're having an aesthetic conversation, I will say, hey, look, my opinion is that this is the way that we should go, and at the end of the day, you're hiring me for my opinion. So not that I'm bullying a client, but I'm not going to necessarily hold back from sharing that opinion, because I would hate to get to the end of it and for them to go, I shouldn't have pushed so hard to have this other option or this, that, or the other. So and I think that comes with a little bit of time and a bit of experience, and a few runs on the board gives you the authority sometimes that you might need to I guess stand by your opinion somewhat. But something that I've always been mindful of is that it is their project. They are risking their money by putting something out there, by asking for something. They've got to they're the ones that are going to have to see it through. So their opinion is very important.
I mean, that's a good segue into the next question, because I'm sure you might be aware, Robin Boyd, famous Australian architect, once noted that there's a sense of Australian ugliness in our society where there is a fascination with mediocre visuals often.
Yeah.
How do you, especially if you may not have the long 13-year plus name brand behind you like yourself, how do you steer their opinions, or more correctly, their appreciation and aspirations to do something that is better than what they're used to?
Well, I mean, normally you have a bit of a head start, because if they're in the studio, then they know they want something. But I think at that point, it's your responsibility to educate them, whether that's by showing them other examples of things that you've done in a similar way, or by showing them other examples of things that other people have done that would be appropriate for them. So often in that early phase, I mentioned before, that discovery phase, we're showing examples of both. We're showing them, I often like to use historical projects and just go, look, the emotion and the language of this object or this interior or this aircraft or whatever it is, this is what I feel is right for you, and this is what we should be trying to do for your project. So it's imparting that knowledge and saying, and with the confidence that this is what we should be doing. And I like to say we, because at that point it's our project together. I like to think, or maybe put myself in the headspace that I am part of their business, because in a way I kind of am. Something that I'm happy to put my name off will be done on their behalf. So I think that's sort of how you have to approach that, in a way, with a view to getting them excited about them, getting them interested in it. And that's also a good moment as well to assess if they're going to be there, because if they're not, then maybe it's not the right project either.
Absolutely. What has been your biggest failure, and what did you learn from it?
Oh, biggest failure. That's a tough one. I didn't think about this.
Maybe an example where you've had something that didn't go to plan.
Oh, guys, come on! It's 1 week. It's like we had one last night.
It's my Wednesday.
Some labels that we printed, they didn't scale properly or whatever it was. I mean, that's a design business. You fail all the time, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, the important thing is to make sure that you learn from it every time. So yeah, I've had some stuff that we designed that maybe I took my eye off the ball, and I'm going back nearly a decade now, that I took my eye off the ball at the time, that it didn't, the client wasn't happy. And so at that point, you've really got to, it teaches you, because it burns your fingers, and it teaches you that, make sure that you are happy and that the client is happy with everything that's coming out. The worst thing, and I've only had this happen once, is where we finish something and the client's like, what's this? I'm not happy with this. So, and that, I think that's probably happened to every designer, and I mean every designer, that happens. So be prepared for it, because it's coming.
Do you have any tips for how to get the client back on side if something like that happens, other than deliver good work next time?
Or do it all over again.
Do it all over again. Yeah. Just if we've made a mistake, then we've made a mistake, and that's it. And have good insurance. And if we made a mistake,
do you think that, like, when things like that happen, it's not necessarily the product is bad, but maybe the communication style between yourself, like, not necessarily you, but like the designer and the client, might be something that needs to be reworked? Or
You need to go to couples therapy.
No, it's look, sometimes it comes out of being too busy and having too much on at once, and thinking that something is tracking well, and it's maybe not. But it's, to be honest, it's only happened badly once or twice for us, and it was typically always in interiors. Interiors is like, it's very challenging field to work in, because as soon as you start building, everyone's screaming all the time. And there's a lot of things that you can't control. It is a very, very challenging space to be in. In product design, it's never happened to us in product design, because really there's so many checks and balances along the way. You know that you're going to make a number of these things. Like, if 500 of them come out and they're all wrong, then something's really, really, really gone wrong, as in been on the moon for 6 months leading up to the production cycle. So,
or it's someone else's fault.
Or it's, yes, someone else's fault at that point.
I've never worked in interior professionally, but I find it incredibly overwhelming. I think if you think of industrial design as like macro lens, because you're looking in at like the really like fine details of like the fillets and the chamfers and the proportions of the object, and then to think about going into an interior and sort of looking at all those objects with that same lens is overwhelming. And like, I find it difficult to move from that macro to that micro and get that right balance between.
It will always be overwhelming. Yeah, it will always be overwhelming if you try to look at it with the same lens. And that took me a while to learn, because I'm more of a self-taught interior designer than was never trained in interior design. Yeah, it's taken me a little while to learn you actually have to look at it completely differently when you're planning out an interior. You almost have to leave a lot more. You have to let a lot more go.
Yeah, so like finding that balance between what you can let go and what you can't let go is tricky.
Well, I think it's you don't have to let anything go, but in those initial phases when you're designing and deciding what to do, you have to accept that you don't know what all the details are yet. That you have a very broad brush view of what you're doing, and be happy with that, and really try to avoid obsessing about the details until you're much later in the project and you're starting to talk about what kind of door handles you're going to use or what kind of lights that you're going to use. And it's a very, very difficult thing for anybody that's done detailed industrial design to go and do interior design. And I struggle with it a lot. And
I'm only talking about it from a hobby perspective, like decorating my own house. I find like incredibly overwhelming, because I also feel like there's this pressure in like being a designer that people come to your house and they're like, ooh, like I bet it's going to be really interesting and fun, and I don't know, maybe I only personally feel that, but I find it quite overwhelmingly terrifying.
It can be. Interiors definitely can be. It is a different mindset. but as once you realize that, then you're able to operate between the two. You're able to switch between the two. But yeah, it is.
I look forward to unlocking that part of my brain or getting that software update.
You've got to lock part of your brain up. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, then I've got to take it away.
Yeah, you've got to take away. You've got to blur your eyes a little bit and be a little bit more.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad my eyesight's getting worse. Then it might help me.
You've got to choose to be ignorant.
Redacted.
Thanks again for joining us today, David. We really, really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the audience will too. Please be sure to check the show notes for any links to anything that we've mentioned. And don't forget, we do currently have a discount from our sponsor, PCBWay. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, this has been Redacted.
The number you have dialed has not been recognized. Please check and try again. The number you have dialed has been
Redacted.